Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk of the Mathematical Consciousness Science online seminar series held in 2020. This seminar series aims to explore the role of mathematics in the scientific study of consciousness and hopes to connect researchers who have an interest in this topic. While every session of the seminar consists of a talk and discussions, the latter are not recorded and the following will only contain the talk. We hope you will enjoy it. For further information, please visit our website, seminar.math-consciousness.org.
I want to talk about the science of consciousness, illusionism, and neutral monism. And let's begin by remembering why we're here. The problem of consciousness goes back a long way. The recognition of it goes back a long way. So here's a famous quote from Thomas Huxley. How it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp. Here, Tyndall writes, the passage from the physics of the brain to the corresponding facts of consciousness is inconceivable as a result of mechanics. Granted that a definite thought and a definite molecular action in the brain occur simultaneously, we do not possess the intellectual organ, nor apparently any rudiment of the organ which would enable us to pass by a process of reasoning from the one to the other. They appear together, but we do not know why. Now, a way around this problem is also very old. It goes back to Galileo. Here's one of his famous passages as he introduces mathematical physics to the world. He says, I think that tastes, odors, colors, and so on are no more than mere names so far as the object in which we place them is concerned, and that they reside only in the consciousness. Hence, if the living creature were removed, all these qualities would be wiped away and annihilated. And for Galileo, this conveniently meant that physical science did not have to deal with the problem of consciousness. And that was probably a good idea at the time, but it was a ticking time bomb, ready to go off when science, and science of the brain in particular, reached the point where people could seriously wonder how to integrate consciousness into the physical picture of the world. So Philip Goff has a new book called Galileo's Error, which says this was the beginning of the problem of consciousness. So we could ask, what is a science of consciousness? What exactly would this be? And immediately you can think of two different ways to go. One would be a merely descriptive science, a kind of psychological botany of a sort, maybe a statistical phenomenology. And we already have a lot of data which fit into this kind of descriptive theorizing. So we know about the structures of quality spaces, color most famously. We have a host of psychophysical stimulus and response laws, which link states of consciousness to physical states. And we're beginning to get some knowledge of brain state to conscious state correlations. So we've heard about the work of Adrian Owen and others, where in some measure it is possible to read the mind from measurements of the brain. Very preliminary at this point, but there's no reason to think it won't continue to advance. And perhaps in some hopeful or maybe not so hopeful future, we will actually be able to read minds by brain measurements. This, though, is a kind of modest theorizing about consciousness. And I don't think it's what people really mean when they want to have a science of consciousness. I think people want to have some kind of theory that would reveal the nature of consciousness. That's a much taller order. But But I want to contrast these cases where we get an advancement of science that reveals something about the nature of the phenomena in question. So long before quantum mechanics, it was noted by Johann Balmer that you could put down a formula that would list the spectral lines for the hydrogen atom. And he produced the formula here, and it made new predictions that were borne out. Not a very satisfactory situation now. But when we quantum mechanics, then we have a revelation of the nature of the atoms, and that generates a comprehensive account of the spectral lines. We know why they appear and where they appear. Another kind of situation before the postulation of quarks, high energy physicists had a kind of particle zoo that they looked at. There were seemingly unlimited number of particles appearing. They could be measured. They could, in some cases, be predicted where they would turn up, but there was no understanding of why or their nature. Quantum chromodynamics generates, again, a comprehensive account of the particle types and the strong interaction between them. So there's the theories where we get some kind of understanding of the nature of the thing. For consciousness, of course, we don't have any such theory. I think it's impossible to produce one, which I'll talk about today. But of course, it would be the ideal, be a theory, scientific theory, which would reveal the nature of consciousness. The problem is the famous explanatory gap. The most salient feature of consciousness, our famous ancestors noted, is its subjectivity or its phenomenality, the what it is likeness of consciousness. It seems like any scientific theory of consciousness that you could come up with will either presuppose the subjective aspect. It might do this overtly, if it takes consciousness to be a fundamental feature, or more typically, it does it covertly as a kind of hidden presupposition in the theory. Or else, the theory will be a theory of something else, something not quite phenomenal consciousness, and the link of this something else to phenomenal consciousness remains mysterious. I think this happens whether you look at high-level or low-level theories. Here's just a couple of examples. I don't have a dog in these races, so I don't mean to suggest these are the best theories, but they're certainly, I'll pick one that's well worked out and well regarded. The global workspace theory. And roughly speaking, this equates consciousness with contents which are widely broadcast to a large number of cognitive systems throughout the brain, and which are sustained via attention and working memory. That's kind of the workspace metaphor that the theory uses. There are many variants on this theory, and many people who have views that are more or less like the global workspace theory. Daniel Dennett maybe wouldn't call himself a workspace theorist, but his view is not that unlike global workspace. But of course, the question is, how would having contents broadcast to a large number of cognitive systems generate or realize subjectivity? There's no real answer to this question. Instead, we get what I would call ersatz subjectivity. So here's a quote from Carruthers' new book, where he says, global workspace theory can explain the intuitive distinction between conscious and unconscious states. Conscious contents are those that are globally broadcast, enabling subjects to be aware of them, reflect on them, and report them. Now, this strikes me as a kind of end run around the problem. don't think we're getting at the heart of subjectivity. In fact, I think it's a very strange way to characterize consciousness. The characterization we get is one where a conscious state is conscious in virtue of being the target of another mental activity or another mental state. Sometimes it's called transitive consciousness. The principle, I call it trans. A state is a conscious state if and only if its subject is in some way aware of it. I don't think this is a very good characterization of consciousness. I think a more straightforward way is needed that doesn't demand metacognition to enable consciousness. And so here's a suggestion, the principle of phenomenal contribution. A state is a conscious state if and only if it contributes to what it is like to be the subject at that time. If we have this a picture, then animals are conscious if there's something it's like to be them, and their conscious state is what contributes to that subjectivity. They don't need to be metacognitively aware of their own mental state in order to be conscious. In any case, the explanatory gap is evident. Why would entry into the global workspace generate a phenomenal contribution? But on the other hand, think about it for a minute. There is absolutely no reason for global workspace theorists to worry about phenomenality. The theory successfully marks out a dynamic system of relations, can explain the role of these contents within the workspace and the broadcasting system. There's no hint of phenomenality here, and none needed. The theory operates perfectly well without it. And trying to shoehorn phenomenal consciousness into the theory, I think, perverts its goals. I think it's actually pretty important to note that the theory's phenomenal consciousness is simply not something they need to worry about when they devise or construct these theories. Now, that's a high-level example. Let's turn to a low-level example, maybe one dear to the hearts of many here. Anyway, my low-level example is the neuron doctrine and predictive coding, or from Cahal to Friston, you might say. Philosophers have become quite excited by this predictive coding picture, and it is a very kind of beautiful way of thinking about the brain. But let's think about the basis, the neuron doctrine that gives the network system. This goes back a long time, the end of the 19th century, but it's worth remembering it was exceptionally controversial at the time. The famous neuroanatomists at the time held that the brain was a single holistic organ, not composed of elementary parts, but rather a continuous network. So the so-called reticular theory, which denied an atomistic or reductionist dictum that the brain whole, depends on its parts. The neuron doctrine, by contrast, gives you a nice atomistic reductionist vision of the brain being composed of discrete units, the neurons. They can be understood independently. Their bioelectrical states interacting with one another determine the total state of the brain. And while these interactions, of course, just because of the sheer number of neurons, become impossibly complex, they're nonetheless governed by well-understood principles of chemistry and electromagnetism. Now, this is a bit of a digression, but I thought it was interesting that it was difficult for the neuron doctrine to gain acceptance. And Cahal himself felt he had to defend this theory against the so-called anti-neuronists. Right? He says the anti-neuronist schools have regressed into the most deplorable confusion. Then he goes on to get personal. He deplored that as long as the psychology of young investigators remains the same, that is, their eagerness for reputation, then anti-neuronism will persist. Finding the vein of originality too deep and difficult, they fall for the unhealthy temptation of doing negative work. Discrediting doctrines and tarnishing reputations, such that anti-neuronists are not very modest or devoted to scientific truth. In fact, they suffer, he said, from arrogant egotism and anarchistic rebelliousness, concealed in the depths of reticularism. So it's a very contentious period. The neuron doctrine succeeded and remains, I think, kind of the foundation picture of the brain. It is a lovely picture, and it's taught us an awful lot. It, in particular, gives us a reason to believe that it's possible to produce simulations of the brain using an artificial neuron system. But if you ask the neuron doctrine itself, okay, what is the brain doing? It doesn't seem to give you an answer, even if it is giving the structure and dynamics of the brain. It does not seem to say anything about what the brain might actually be doing. Now, it's an interesting question whether there would be such a theory. I don't think there has to be. If you compare the study of biology to, for example, the study of solar systems, we have a nice theory of biology that explains, as it were, what biology is doing. There's no such theory of solar systems. We can describe them, but there's no overarching theory of what solar systems are doing or any function of them. But there is on the horizon this view called the predictive, I'll call it the predictive coding paradigm, which might be a deep theory of brain function. So here, very crudely, you know better than I, all this stuff. So predictive coding is kind of a synthesis of Helmholtzian unconscious inferential systems with the mathematical mechanism for updating provided by Reverend Bayes. And it posits a kind of error loop where the brain generates a predictive hypothesis, which it will compare to actual incoming data and adjust the hypothesis using the Bayesian reasoning, Bayesian updating. Very nice picture, which does seem, you might well say, oh, yeah, I can see the brain is organized to do exactly that. So on the model, the brain begins with some kind of prior probability function, a preliminary model, so to speak. This is a model of the way the world is thought to be or is expected to be. Although you should ask, I'm going to talk about what exactly is expected here. What sort of level of input is the expectation defined for? You think Markov blankets here, there's an issue of where or what the input should be characterized as. In any case, the model is compared to the incoming data, an error signal is generated, and there are ways then to use Bayesian updating to change the model to bring it in line with the error signal, which hopefully in the future will reduce error signal. Now, in some philosophers, this has the appearance of a bandwagon. People really have jumped onto the predictive coding. But I think it does look like a attractive and comprehensive viewpoint that immediately connects to brain processes we already understand, roughly or overall the dynamics of neural activation vectors. Now, I want to talk about two worries here. The first one, you can already guess. There's nothing in the scheme, no more so than in the global workspace theory, that links Bayesian learning to the generation or realization of phenomenal consciousness. Now, I think you can imagine how links to what I called ersatz subjectivity can be envisioned very easily. So that you could sort of have hierarchical coding schemes or levels of models, and you could certainly have a model which is about another model. And that will be something like the ersatz subjectivity we talked about. But I think there's also another problem, although it's not disconnected from the problem of phenomenal consciousness. But it's a distinct problem, and this is a semantical problem about the contents of the model, what the perceptual signals are, what they mean, and what the error signal is or means. And I think you have looming here a problem with what I will call cognitive alienation. Our conscious thoughts encompass determinate contents over a huge range of subject matters. And the Bayesian error correction loop, the predictive coding scheme posits, is a brain-bound loop or brain and local environment-bound loop, schooled by evolutionary pressure. And the question there is, how can that local loop realize the contents we can think about? Why would it? Right? You might say, I guess, that one limiting case, what the brain expects is a certain pattern of activation to be hitting its receptors. That's what it's operating over. And its error signal is between a model, which is a model of activation signals, versus the activations it's actually getting. Why that should have any connection to the contents of thought, I think is a difficult, very difficult question. Now, here's an example, not from predictive coding, but from a not that far off area, the deep learning systems that are going to drive our cars apparently soon. And this is a problem of adversarial contents. So here's an example. The top line you see on the top, 843.137.9407. So you have a very well-trained deep learning network that can recognize numerals, and it can get the top line perfectly. The second line, 843.137.9407, is slightly different. The middle line is the difference between the two. Now, the bottom line, though, the same neural network recognize these characters as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Completely wrong. The third line, with the woman in a dress and the ambulance and the banana, the neural network recognizes the top line perfectly, and many, many other similar cases. The bottom row, every image is recognized as the Boletus mushroom. The difference to the human eye is small. Now, whatever these systems are thinking about, they're not thinking about what we think they're thinking about or what we hope they're thinking about. Their system is recognizing something very, very different, which just happens to overlap with what we thought we were training in a large number of cases. Now, so the worry of cognitive alienation is what mechanism guarantees that the contents which the predictive brain is discerning are the ones we are consciously thinking about. The brain is using models which takes perceptual input signals and error signals defined over patterns of neural activation. Now, these have been subject to evolutionary selection for local fitness. And you can imagine there are lots of cases where you might wonder whether that has anything to do with what we think the contents are. Where you take the argumentative theory of reason, it says, well, reason is designed to advance your social standing amongst your fellows by issuing certain sounds that they will respond to. Got nothing to do with actual rationality. Now, the problem is there's no particular reason to think the signals are operating over the meanings accessible to us in conscious thoughts. Unconscious thoughts, of course, don't give rise to this problem because there's no drive to assign a particular content to an unconscious thought. We can assign them any neural patterns that seem to do the job. This is the link to phenomenality. So what we are consciously aware of thinking, our cognitive phenomenology, doesn't seem to link to what this picture of the brain is providing for the contents. This, I think, is most evident if you go for more abstract thoughts, although I don't think that's the only place the problem arises. So let's think about this example. What is my brain thinking about when I am thinking about the problem of the structural indiscernibility of the imaginary numbers I and minus I? Now, this is a problem in the philosophy of mathematics because I and minus I have exactly the same or participate in exactly the same mathematical structures, but they're obviously different numbers, right? Does that mean structuralism about mathematics is wrong? Well, I don't know the answer to the problem in the philosophy of mathematics. The question is just how are we able to think about complex numbers? Now, you might say, well, maybe my brain has generated an internal loop with a model isomorphic to the complex numbers. But that model doesn't distinguish between I and minus I. That's the original problem. So maybe my brain is really just applying the error loop to an uninterpreted internal symbol system. So it's got some stuff with the symbol I and minus I, and then some extra stuff about philosophy of mathematics symbols, something like that. But that's alienation, because I'm thinking about numbers here. And right now you are thinking about numbers. It's not easy to see how such contents get generated. This is a problem for high-level theories as well, but sometimes it's not so evident. They often just assume they have high-level contents available and then talk about how the contents are going to be operated on or broadcast or manipulated. But of course, those contents would have to be grounded in mechanisms realizing the global workspace, say, in global workspace theory. So you'll get the same problem of cognitive alienation. Now, once again, the theories in issue, they don't need to introduce phenomenal consciousness, either cognitive, sensory, affective, cognitive, or any other kind, into their theories. They don't suffer any deficiencies by missing phenomenal consciousness, not in their own terms. Right? Now, this could lead you down a certain path. This is a path towards perdition, but it's one that you might be inclined to take. If you're inclined to take ontological guidance from the pronouncements of science, and you've noticed that there is no need for these theories to posit or use phenomenality, you will wonder about the legitimacy about phenomenal consciousness. And thus you get theories sometimes called illusionism about consciousness. Now, what is illusionism? It's the view that phenomenal consciousness does not exist. Science never needs to posit it, and science encompasses all of reality, at least potentially. Then there is no need to posit or believe in phenomenal consciousness. Now, illusionism comes in various forms. Some illusionists sound like they don't want to really deny phenomenal consciousness. They want to deny some philosophical illusions or odd kind of ways of interpreting consciousness that philosophers have come up with. I'll call that weak illusionism. It doesn't deny the existence of consciousness, but some weird features of it. So maybe essential intrinsicality, essential privacy, some of the features of what are called qualia. But weak illusionism doesn't relieve the mystery. You still have phenomenal consciousness, and we have no idea how it gets realized or put into the material world as currently understood. So if you're going to be an illusionist, I think you should be a strong illusionist, and that's the view that there is no phenomenal consciousness. Now, even if we try to be strong illusionists, it's hard to deny that it seems that consciousness exists. And this immediately suggests self-refutation. Here's the trivial argument. If consciousness is an illusion, then it merely seems that it exists. But if anything seems to exist, that seeming is a state of consciousness, so consciousness exists. QED. Now, I think this is a cogent argument, but the illusionist will regard the argument as an equivocation, an elementary fallacy. There are two senses of the word seems. An epistemic sense, as in when I say, it seems to me that Trump damaged America, and a phenomenal sense, as in when I say, I seem to hear a high-pitched whining noise. Now, premise one of the argument uses the epistemic sense. Premise two uses the phenomenal sense. And the switch, of course, invalidates the argument. So the instant refutation is not obviously correct. So let us, for the sake of the argument, grant illusionism. If so, we note that the epistemic sense of seems requires the content. When you have an epistemic seeming, you'll have something like, it seems that P for some P. And if we think about illusionism, then we have to ask, what is the content of the illusionist illusion? It's something like phenomenal consciousness exists. That's the content of the epistemic seeming that fools us into believing consciousness exists. Now, I want you to think about whether it's possible that illusionism is wrong, that maybe phenomenal consciousness does exist. Now, if we assume illusionism, of course, that's not true, but we're wondering just if it's possible. Right? Is there a possible world where phenomenal consciousness exists? Now, I think it stretches credulity even further than illusionism to claim that phenomenal consciousness is metaphysically impossible. That would mean Cartesian dualism is not only false, but necessarily false. Berkeleyan idealism, metaphysically impossible. The radical emergence of phenomenal consciousness from matter, metaphysically impossible. I don't think any of those, I think all those claims would be highly implausible. So phenomenal consciousness might be true. There might be phenomenal consciousness, even if there isn't in our world. So it's possible there's a world physically just like ours, but in which phenomenal consciousness does exist. There's nothing in the illusionist picture that prevents the existence of phenomenal consciousness. The reason we accept illusionism is physicalist hegemony and ontological parsimony. That's what favors illusionism. It would be very strange to suppose that our world has some feature that actively blocks the existence of phenomenal consciousness. Certainly, such a supposition would be far beyond anything in physical theory. It would be as if the true physical theory was the standard model of physics, plus general relativity, plus the phenomenal consciousness eliminator system. There's, of course, no reason at all to add that third element to physical theory. What that means is, and you'll see, this is a reverse zombie argument. On the supposition of illusionism, there's a possible world physically identical to ours in which phenomenal consciousness does exist, as it merely seems to exist in our world. Now let's call this world beta. The philosophically inclined inhabitants of beta will wonder if physicalism is true. Core physicalism is the view that any duplicate, any physical duplicate of our world is fully identical to our world. The inhabitants of beta will come up with the zombie argument, and they will think about illusionism. They will imagine a world physically just like theirs, but in which there is no phenomenal consciousness, in which their counterparts are philosophical zombies. If illusionism is true, the inhabitants of beta are imagining our world. Our world refutes their hypothesis of physicalism. But since beta is a minimal physical duplicate of our world, which is not identical to our world, it's not identical to our world because, of course, it has phenomenal consciousness. Physicalism is refuted from our point of view as well. So if illusionism is true, physicalism is false. But remind me, what was the point of illusionism? The point of illusionism was to save physicalism in the face of the intuition that phenomenal consciousness exists. So I think the intuitive viewpoint wins here, should win. It's worth noting, illusionism entails that zombies are possible, because if illusionism is true, we are such zombies. Many of you may remember Dennett's famous quote in Consciousness Explained, where he says, "We are all zombies," the zombies that philosophers imagine. And then he adds the footnote, which I think I can remember. It would be an act of desperate intellectual dishonesty to quote this out of context. Well, I haven't quoted it here, but in fact, that's what the assumption is, unless you claim you're only a weak illusionist. But I think a weak illusionist doesn't avoid the problem of phenomenal consciousness. Now, here's another. You can tell I got kind of carried away thinking about this. Here's another argument against illusionism, favoring some kind of phenomenal consciousness, cognitive in this case. Following Descartes, I know that something exists because something is present to me right now. Now, what is present to me is intimately involved with my state of consciousness. The critical premise underpinning my knowledge that something exists is my consciousness that something is present. Right? And this knowledge is unassailable. I could not be wrong about this. You can ask yourself, do you think you could be wrong that something exists? I think you could not be wrong, and it is unassailable knowledge. If illusionism is true, then there is no consciousness of presence. The illusionist zombie falsely believes they are conscious of presence. They are deluded in this seemingly conscious thought. Now, a false premise cannot ground knowledge, let alone unassailable knowledge. So it seems worrying that if illusionism is true, I don't know if anything exists. Now, the illusionist zombie has, maybe, unconscious awareness of things. Presumably, that's the case. I think it's a huge issue, actually, whether zombies can have real thoughts, but let us suppose it is so. The zombie has unconscious awareness of things. What would those things be? Well, not immediate presence, but rather the things triggering the unconscious surrogates of this awareness. And whatever those things are, they do not ground unassailable knowledge, or they might not exist. So to speak, the illusionist zombie might be dreaming. I know that right now, I think I know, in the ordinary sense, I know there's a monitor in front of me. This is not unassailable knowledge. Right? I have to move to what is present in order to get unassailable knowledge. So I think it is fruitless and self-defeating to deny the existence of phenomenal consciousness. At the same time, the generation of phenomenal consciousness is mysterious. This is not because of a failing of scientific theorizing about the brain and mind. The scientific theorizing has no need to posit phenomenal consciousness. I venture to say that it's not a failing of consciousness science, but a misunderstanding of the nature of reality and what the aims of science are. So now I'm interested to see what you think about this next line of thought. So the metaphysical misunderstanding is to think that we understand what the physical world is. Back in the 17th century and before, our ancestors, people like Galileo and Descartes, could be forgiven for thinking they understood the nature of the physical world. They had a clear, positive conception of the nature of matter. Hard little bits of impenetrable stuff bouncing around. Modern physics reveals that the fundamental nature of the material world is a complete mystery. Even with hints that observers and their participation might have an irreducible role to play in it. Certainly, we no longer have any positive conception of the nature of matter. I think the misunderstanding of the aim of science is to take the goal of science to be the revelation of the nature of reality. I think the aim of science is more modest. It's an empiricist one. The aim of science is to produce models, theories, to explain and predict the course of experience. And following my old teacher, Bas van Fraassen, the appropriate attitude towards acceptance of a scientific theory is not T is true, but rather T is empirically adequate. Scientific metaphysician says T is true. The empiricist says T is empirically adequate. You can note who's more likely to be correct. One entails the other, so the empiricist is making the safer bet. But I think the empiricist has pinpointed what the goal of science is. Now, my last few slides, neutral monism. So neutral monism is a view that avoids both mistakes. It's the view that fundamental reality is neither physical nor mental. It has famous champions. Here we have William James and Bertrand Russell. What is this putative, neutral foundation of reality? Well, the champions gave it unfortunate names. James called it pure experience. Russell sometimes used sense data. And these suggest that the neutral is really, actually some kind of mental entity or an aspect of consciousness. So, but don't think that way. And they didn't really think that way either. They didn't mean it to be taken to be a mental. The neutral is just what is present to us. So presence in this sense does not mean present to mind. Minds are structures of presence, and so are bodies. Philosopher Mark Johnson said, contrary to, I think, traditional orthodoxy, we are not sources of presence. We are samplers of presence. Presence is what is fundamental, not minds or bodies. Now, a natural question to ask then would be, how much presence is there? And you might think presence is a monadic property of the universe. In that case, if one has access to it, then anyone has access to it all, right? If one has access to any, one has access to all. It just is what is present. And then it seems like I must be the only one to enjoy it, a kind of solipsism, or maybe we are all one. There's a nice book by Caspar Hare which outlines this kind of solipsistic picture of presence, but I don't think it's mandatory. That you could call sparse presence, the solipsistic picture. But you can imagine a medium presence. Presence could be a relational property of the universe with multitudes of structures. And what I call myself then is one such structure of elements of presence, and you are another. You might ask, is all presence to mind? I think that's the same question as, does every element of presence form a part of a structure that amounts to a subject? And if you think yes, I think you generate a kind of panpsychist picture of the world. but I don't think you have to say yes. You could add more presence, abundant presence, I'll call it. This I like to call it a barbarian picture of the world after Julian Barber. I guess his name, I think, is spelled O-U-R actually, but anyway, barbarian picture. So in this picture, every possible form of presence exists, and some structures of presence form what we call worlds or universes. They are structures of structures conforming to principles of organization that we call the laws of nature. On this view, time, space, consciousness are all emergent features. They are all relational systems of presence. In all of these cases, ultimate reality is right before your eyes. Right? If you want to know ultimate reality, just look, hear, see. A science of consciousness, then, is going to be an attempt to probe a part of the structure of presence that we find ourselves in. The general goal of science is to produce a kind of totalizing model of the structures of presence that we find ourselves in. May not be possible to do it, of course. Presence itself lies outside or behind the scientific investigation. It's a bit like Russellian monism in that respect. Human consciousness is a structure of presence, a very complicated one, integrated into the larger structure we call the world. That's why we can model and will be able to model consciousness and its relation to the brain. But presence itself is not explainable. It's as unexplainable as existence itself, as that's what it is, just existence. And that is the end.